Hello and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Gord Gilmour, editor of the Manitoba Co-operator. I like trains. Big trains, fast trains, freight trains, even model trains. But I am especially interested in grain trains. That's because they're the vital link between the industry I grew up in and the global markets where Canadian crops are needed. And that final link is no simple thing. It's long, thousands of kilometers long, and it's difficult through some of the worst winter weather on the planet and up and down some really large mountain ranges. It's not surprising that sometimes things go off the rails, so to speak. But it also seems like it's almost an annual occurrence. This episode, I'll be speaking with fellow train geek and Senior Manager of Transportation and Biofuel Policy with the Canadian Canola Growers Association, Steve Pratt, who'll tell us what could make the transportation system work better.
So we are seeing as proportion of revenue some pretty significant capital investment to mostly the main line of Western Canada and some of those pinch points.
We'll also speak with Markets Farm analyst Bruce Burnett about the weather that's driving markets these days.
There's going to be a lot of countries that are going to need some grain here over the next 6 months.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Save money, make money with AGI Nico dryers. AGI Nico mixed flow screenless dryers provide 1 to 2 pounds heavier test weight per bushel and require less maintenance than screen dryers. Stainless steel fuel trains mean no rust or corrosion to worry about. AGI Nico Dryer Manager puts remote management and monitoring in your hands. And with 30% in fuel savings, you'll save on every load. That's money in your pocket. Visit aggrowth.com/Nico for more info. That's aggrowth.com/Nico.
We're back. It's been a good fall for grain movement, but now winter is upon us, and this is the traditional danger zone for grain transportation in Canada. As the mercury drops, movement gets slower, and periodically a crisis emerges. It is too soon to say if that'll happen this winter, but the fact we've all come to half expect a disaster suggests some serious systemic issues. Steve Pratt is Senior Manager, Transportation and Biofuels for the Canadian Canola Growers Association. He joins us today to talk trains, transport, and what it might take to finally fix this mess. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me, Gord.
So I'm looking at the grain transportation system so far this crop year, and it seems like it's largely been working all right. I've seen some self-congratulatory press releases from the railways as they've hit new targets and things like that. Is that what you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, certainly. When you take a look at the array of the data sources we have, certainly at the highest level, the grain is moving through the system at a pretty brisk pace. As you said, both railways set company records for the month of October, pretty impressive, combined over 6 million tons. But when you dig a little bit deeper, like for instance, the Ag Transport Coalition that looks at demand and supply of rail cars from the railway for bulk grain shippers. There was a period there of about 6-7 weeks where CP had dipped and CN remained pretty solid in their service to the grain industry. So I guess the picture there is, yes, in aggregate, it's moving. When you look at the kind of week-to-week spotting of the cars in response to the demand, it's been a little hit and miss for CP in particular. Both have picked it up as of late. So it really leaves you with that, that kind of notion that if everything was ticking, we could move even more. So that's always what we want to be striving for. But you're right. In general, it looks pretty good crop year to date.
But there's the rub right there, crop year to date.
Right.
That's the thing I want to talk to you a little bit about next. With our climate, winter is always the toughest season. So how crucial are the next few weeks and months to the grain transportation system?
I mean, huge, right? We've got that, let's call it a 75 million ton crop to move. We've had 10 straight weeks of over 1 million to 1.8 million tons of producer deliveries in Western Canada into the system. But as you note. I mean, we've got October, November, December are kind of peak time for getting our product to Tidewater and out to our international buyers. We're on the cusp, and in some parts of Western Canada, it's already come, but we're on that cusp of obviously the snow, and then that real factor of that minus 25, that kind of magic tipping point there for railway operations and their safety issues with their braking and whatnot. So it's coming.
Yes, I'm going to stop you there. The safety issue with braking, I'm not sure I understand that. Or, well, more to the point, I think I understand it, but I want to make sure I do. When you talk about that, what they're talking about is air pressure, is it not?
Correct.
That they need to generate air pressure, and when it gets colder, it's harder to do. Shorter trains, less capacity, correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. And the railways have, I mean, they acknowledge this. They know that. Obviously, we know that. And they've been taking steps over the last few years, operationally putting in, compressor cars on unit trains and things like that. Obviously, trying to keep trains together with the power on, i.e. some of those loop track models where you're not releasing that pressure and it's maintaining its buildup. But I mean, when you look at railway operations, that is one of the major factors that, again, it might be incremental, but that demand is, that capacity rather, is slipping away as we are kind of adding time getting those trains to start with their loaded unit trains of grain. So there's that aspect. And that kind of, kind of eating away and nibbling away at capacity. And then there's obviously the physical impediments of snow, avalanches, washouts, that type of stuff, which, I mean, no one knows when that's going to happen. That's always that big X factor in the equation every year. And certainly, I mean, we as, farm groups and producers are concerned, and we obviously like to have the most fluid supply chain as possible. And to the railways' credit, I mean, they through their publication of their grain reports, they are kind of publicly telling the minister and stakeholders what they plan on doing every year as far as their corporate approaches to mitigation and disaster response. So, I mean, we know a lot more now about what their thinking is around how to do winter operations than we did, let's call it 5 years ago. But again, as you said, we know it's coming, and there's always going to, there's typically some sort of event, and really that it's that ability to bounce back and get running as fast as possible, which is really kind of impacts our supply chain.
That's interesting, because I think most of us would be pretty sympathetic to the railways when they have something like a wildfire or an avalanche or something like that. I mean, that's kind of under the heading of stuff happens, right? And I mean, nobody would blame them for that. But it does strike me that, we always hit this point of the season where winter's looming and we're all kind of side-eyeing the railway system and wondering if it's going to hold together for the year. And that seems a little strange to me. I mean, winter comes every year. We're all pretty good problem solvers, and especially practical folks like in the railway business. How come this problem just keeps coming back year after year?
That's a really interesting question, Gord. And, I think many of us sit back and wonder about this as well. I mean, we like to think in a modern society with all as you say, problem solvers and smart folks out there, we're kind of dealing with an issue that's been around since Confederation and the establishment of the railways, right? And I don't have a solution. I don't have an answer for you, Gord. I mean, it's just one of those things where we can do some amazing things as a society and as an industry, and it is one of those kind of perplexing annual questions about why is this still holding us back, and success of not only maintaining our current export profile, but ideally, as we move forward, growing it for grain as a commodity and for all commodities in Canada.
So do you have any sense then about what some of the changes to the system might be that could actually solve this problem? I guess one hesitates to say once and for all, but let's say for a more durable solution than we have right now.
Well, I guess, the main thing, at least on the winter side of things, they'll talk about, or, the industry and the government talks about resiliency, right? And the ability to bounce back from disruptions, be they acute and or chronic. And a lot of that comes down to investment. So we are seeing, as proportion of revenue, some pretty significant capital investment to mostly the main line of Western Canada and some of those pinch points. But certainly, I mean, railroading through the mountains, I guess, difficult any time of the year. But There's no quick fixes, but there are some significant, like sidings, reinforcing structures and civil works and the sheds and the snow sheds and whatnot. I mean, there's stuff going on. It's incremental. I don't know if there's any one kind of fix-all solution, but certainly all those solutions combined that are working to address that problem cost money, and those are not one-time investments. Those are longer-term succession of investments, which we are seeing to the railway's credit.
I know that the supply chain report came out recently, and it flagged a number of things. Anything in there that you think is of note and of merit and should go forward? Yeah,
it's timely. I mean, that task force had 100 days to put together the report. It got released in early October. The grain sector, other sectors are obviously looking at this quite intently. And overall, Gord, I just say that report was actually raised a few eyebrows from analysts and observers, because it was very, I call it pro-shipper in its orientation. So there's a lot of things in there that have kind of antecedents back to the early 2000s, and the Rail Freight Service Review, and then the Bill C-30 in 2014 in the aftermath of the 2013-14 meltdown, and then most recently Bill C-49. There's some interesting things in there. Certainly, one that is I'd say that the only recommendation in there that would actually inject physical and commercial competition into the current Canadian rail freight service environment would be an extension of the 30-kilometer interswitching provision, the regulated interswitching. That is something that, the grain sector in particular had a taste of that back with extended interswitching in 2014, 2015. Certainly there was use of it by some grain shippers, especially those looking to move product to the United States. That extended interswitching had a sunset clause in it, so it finally died. But the task force report they don't name a particular distance, but the recommendation is there for officials to look at that and determine what that might look like. So that is a piece, a pro-competitive piece, and even if it's not being used, it's the very existence of it as a competitive force that shippers can start to have a different style of negotiation with their particular railway around service, and not so much pricing, but around service and what they'd like to do commercially. A couple other little things in there I'll just mention briefly. There's some interesting stuff around the powers of the Canadian Transportation Agency, around own motion powers, and that was a power given in Bill C-49 back in 2018. And there's been one use of that.
Just to stop you there,
sure.
Own use or own. Sorry, I've even forgotten the phrase, but I remember seeing that. And it basically means the CTA doesn't need somebody to complain. If they look at a situation and they feel it needs to be addressed, they can go and start an investigation kind of on their own book, correct?
That's right. Yeah, they need the approval of the Minister of Transport, but then they have 90 days. They can do an investigation, and as a quasi-judicial tribunal, they actually have a lot of power. They can order railways to construct civil works. They can do other things, and it's quite a powerful tool. We have one instance of its use. They did a Vancouver investigation back in 2019. That finally made its way through the Supreme Court just a couple months ago, and it was dismissed. So it was held up by the Supreme Court. That process as the first precedent setting. So there's some interesting stuff around even strengthening that in the report. And then there's some other good things around data and transparency and whatnot. But we shall see. I mean, that report has no stand-in, right? It was a blue ribbon task force report to the minister. The minister and cabinet can choose to do something about it or not do something. One would think they're going to do, they'll probably pick and choose some flavor from it. But certainly there's no kind of concrete or there's no regulatory path forward. They would have to introduce. One thing I'll say, Gord, is that they're going to. The Minister of Transport has indicated they are going to develop a transportation, supply chain strategy, and from that might come a regulatory package to support movement towards that. So, still very muddy. What's going to come out of this? There's no established timelines, but again, in this kind of long incremental game where we're going to kind of move towards some sort of vision of a better state and more resilient supply chain, we're moving in the right direction.
What can farmers do to support that movement in the right direction and light a fire under the folks who actually make the decisions?
Yeah, I think really from the farmer's voice to those decision makers, be it departmental officials or federal cabinet ministers and MPs, and on the political side, is that that core message that transportation matters. We can't, matters to our economy, but also back to the farm gate, right? And you as an individual farmer and your operations are affected by transportation, and we can't. The world's spinning around us. Our competitors are always on the move. We need to find ways to have supply chain resiliency, capacity that's sufficient to move the crop of today and the crop of the future. And I think just bringing home that farmer voice and that farmer story about how this actually impacts back to the farm gate is powerful. It's one thing for companies to make representation to government and talk about revenue, but when it comes back to farm families and how this affects every farmer in a region or across Western Canada, that's a very powerful message and a powerful voice that is listened to.
Steve, thanks for taking the time to guide us through some of this today.
Thanks for having me on, Gord.
That was Steve Pratt of the Canadian Canola Growers Association on Canada's perennial grain transport challenges and the ongoing search for solutions. You're listening to Between the Rows, and I'm Manitoba Co-operator Editor Gord Gilmour. It's a tough time for crops around the world. Argentina's baking, Australia's drowning, and the US hard red winter wheat crop is gasping for moisture under the snow. So what does this mean for markets? Bruce Burnett, Director of Markets and Weather for Markets Farm, joins us now to fill us in. Bruce, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So, weather. Weather is enough to give you an ulcer sometimes, and for growers around the globe, it seems to be happening. What's happening in Argentina and Australia? I hear drought, I hear flooding. I know that's going to have an impact on the markets, but you know better than I. What's going on?
Well, certainly we're seeing some fairly big impacts now from the weather in both of those countries. You can probably make an argument that it's related to the La Nina that's still ongoing here for about the third winter in a row here, although it's going to subside probably by the end of next month into January. But that's left Australia extremely wet. There's lots of flooding in the eastern part of the country, at least anyway. So the crops grown in Western Australia generally are in good shape. They haven't had any bad harvest weather. Typically in Australia, your harvest weather is hot and dry, and there's no problem with it. But this year in Eastern Australia, much like it did last year, the rains have just come during November and December, and are forecast to continue into December here. So it's hitting them at the heart of their filling stage into the harvest season. Mm-hmm. So the area impacted so far in terms of the harvest has been up in northern New South Wales and Queensland, where they produce some of the higher protein, higher quality wheat. That crop is very poor because of the rains that fell during the harvest period. As the harvest moves south into southern New South Wales, Victoria, southern Australia, we get into some crops, a more diverse crop situation, and you get into some crops like lentils and peas and canola as well that's also getting flooded here. So we'll have to see how the situation evolves, but the forecasts for a record crop in Australia, especially on the wheat side, I think are a little far-fetched now because there are going to be some significant losses to the quantity produced, but also the quality is going to be downgraded significantly. And that is going to benefit Western Canadian growers, I think, because the high-quality Asian markets will have to go elsewhere to find some grain, and we've had a very high-quality crop this year.
That's what I've heard anecdotally too. But the protein premium's been low, at least it was earlier in the fall. Do you see that changing?
Protein premiums are probably going to remain relatively flat. We've had a a decent protein crop in North America. Add to that the fact that although HRW production was down, it was high protein as well. So again, you could call it a surplus of protein wheat, and that's keeping the spreads fairly narrow there. If you look at the futures contracts between Kansas City and Minneapolis, actually the spreads have started to widen a little bit, and that can be inferred to as a bit of a protein premium. And that's just, again, I think demand for wheat offshore is very, very strong. Demand for high quality wheat, even if it's only moderate protein, is also going to remain fairly strong. So I think those protein premiums are going to remain fairly flat here as we go through this growing season. It doesn't help that the HRW areas are still dry, and it looks like we might get into another situation where the hard red winter protein is going to be a little higher than they normally produce in 2023.
And then what about this drought in Argentina? What's happening down there?
This is a spectacular drought. And again, Argentina tends to be dry during a La Nina. And certainly we're seeing the impacts this year. The chief producing areas have received very little in the way of precipitation. We had some rains last week, which was good, helped crops sort of hang in there. But to be perfectly blunt, a lot of the crops were not in very good shape before the rains. They're in the late filling stage. They're probably about 2 or 3 weeks away from starting harvest. So there's minimal amount of yield gain that you can have, but at least they're going to conserve the production levels. USDA dropped their production to 15.5 million tons in the last report. But a lot of the estimates coming from Argentina indicate the crop's even smaller. And here at Markets Farm, we think it's probably around 12 million tons.
So how does that stack up against what you would expect for on a more typical year out of Argentina? Like, what's the scope of the drop?
Well, last year they would produce 19 million. They produced over 19 million tons. And typically they would produce in the 17 to 20 million ton range. So it's a
30%, then roughly a third.
Yeah, it's about a third, a drop in a third. But the dynamics are even more interesting for 2 points. Number one, 12 million tons means that at some point, I think the government is going to have to restrict exports of wheat. Their largest customer is their next door neighbor, Brazil, and they supply most of Brazilian needs. There is not enough grain in Argentina to supply that, as well as keep domestic bread prices and wheat prices under control. So that's why I think the government's going to move in here and restrict exports. So this is going to have a fairly big impact, not only in Brazil, because they're going to have to go elsewhere for their needs, but also throughout Latin America, because Argentina supplies a lot of Latin American destinations with wheat. And that's certainly those customers are going to be looking elsewhere for wheat supplies. So you're seeing a double whammy here with Australia and Argentina coming up short in terms of supply, and buyers are going to have to look elsewhere for the product in the coming months.
So, well, where are they going to look then? Where are the obvious places that are going to backfill this demand?
Yeah, I think it largely depends on where you're located and what your quality needs are. Russian wheat is still available. There's lots of it this year. So we're going to probably see Russian wheat move in. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a number of cargoes go into Brazil as well this year, just because of the situation. And the Brazilian requirements aren't particularly high in terms of quality. But other Latin American destinations, especially those that are further away from the Black Sea, especially the western coast of South America, you're probably looking at a pickup in Canadian business as well as U.S. business. But the U.S. is suffering from a little bit of a problem here in that they have. They have.
I want to ask you about.
Yeah, because they're too busy exporting soybeans to worry too much about wheat.
Yeah,
but anyway,
I want to ask you about those. Is their wheat supply? It's dry down there. They're especially in their hard red winter country. What's that going to shake out like? How dire is that situation right now? It's certainly capturing a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's capturing a lot of attention, although I may argue that the market is really discounting it quite a bit, because we haven't seen a lot of support from the news about crop conditions this fall and in hard red winter wheat growing areas. But I think as we move through the growing season here, we'll see more and more attention being paid to it. There's two issues there as far as I'm concerned. Number one is that a significant amount of the crop still isn't emerged yet. And again, this past week we had winter storm warnings in Kansas, and temperatures got very, very low. So essentially part of this crop is going to be a spring wheat crop. It's just essentially a winter wheat crop that unfortunately didn't get up in time. And that sometimes happens every year. It did happen last year. But again, I think you would have to say that the prospects for this crop are below average, below normal. Whether they're going to end up as bad as this year, I think depends a lot about what happens in the spring. But still, I think the production is going to be, lower than you would say on average that you would produce in hard red winter. So that's going to make things very, very tight. We're at the tightest ending stocks for HRW and HRS since that 2008 period, 2007, 2008 period. So really, we've cut down wheat stocks and the prospects don't look good for this upcoming year.
That should be a recipe for higher prices, one would think. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I think it's, again, as I said, I think the market's ignoring it a little bit. They're worried about this overhang of Russian production and I guess maybe even crossing their fingers that it's going to all work out. But you're looking at very strong demand still, despite the fact that prices are relatively high. And there's going to be a lot of countries that are going to need some grain here over the next 6 months before we get into the sort of the new crop, winter wheat crops in the Northern Hemisphere.
Let's talk a little bit about the conditions here closer to home then. We had a decent crop this year, I think most people would say. As you note, especially in our wheat crop, it seemed to be very good. What about the drought situation, though, in the southern prairies? Here where I'm in Manitoba, the situation is looking pretty good. I know it's not as good in other portions. Have we had enough precipitation in the southern prairies to turn things around? Are you comfortable with saying the drought's off?
No, not in the least. And again, we've picked up a little bit of moisture in the snows here in late October, early November. That's given us some above normal precipitation. But if you take a look at it, we've developed deficits, in Western Saskatchewan, Eastern Alberta, and those deficits last year were in the 150 millimeter range. And this pickup in precipitation is about 10 millimeters. So as you can see, there's a long way to go yet. And again, any precipitation is good. We'll take as much snow as we can in these dry areas. But really, we would like to see some rains in those areas, probably now in the spring, because it's a little bit too late in the season to get significant rainfall here. But really, it's a situation that I think a lot of people, as you say, in the northern growing areas and the eastern growing areas, we had a decent crop this year, but there were some crops in Western Saskatchewan and Eastern Alberta that were worse than last year. And they're coming into this growing season, or coming into the fall freeze up, at least anyway, in worse shape than they were last year in terms of subsoil moisture. So it's one of those things where we need to pay very close attention to this, because it could impact the 2023 crop year if we don't get some good rains here in the spring.
It seems to me, as the layperson, I don't study markets and I don't study the weather nearly as closely as you do. But even for me, as just sort of a casual observer, it seems like we really faced a lot of weather challenges lately. Is that just sort of selection bias on my part, or has it been a much more challenging weather situation over the last few years than perhaps we've been used to?
Well, I think again we've hit some key production areas. And again, Canada was the poster boy last year for this, where we saw significant drops in production. And we are seeing more, this may be a little bit more normal than you would think about. We've had successive years since about the mid 2012 to 2020 range here, that where the crops came in globally pretty well. Like, I mean, they were pretty good. And a few problems here and there every year, but not extensive problems in major producing areas. This past couple of years certainly has seen that. And we've seen that in the stocks of grain globally, where those stocks of grains are dropping. Demand is still strong. So therefore, we're seeing these price increases here. And again, it's going to be one of those situations where you need the weather to be very consistent across the world for the next couple of years to get crop supplies or stocks up to levels where the market is far more comfortable with it. But that's going to take time.
And in the meantime, I guess we're all looking at the skies like always, eh?
Yes, that's right.
Well, thanks, Bruce. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Good to talk with you, Gord.
That was Bruce Burnett of Markets Farm. You can check out the new marketsfarm.com. Their website's been updated to give users, both subscribers and non-subscribers, quicker access to markets news. You can now quickly play the twice-daily audio market updates from your phone. And that's another edition of Between the Rows. I'm Gord Gilmour of the Manitoba Co-operator, saying we hope to see you again next week.
Save money, make money with AGI Nico dryers. AGI Nico mixed flow screenless dryers provide 1 to 2 pounds heavier test weight per bushel and require less maintenance than screen dryers. Stainless steel fuel trains mean no rust or corrosion to worry about. AGI Nico Dryer Manager puts remote management and monitoring in your hands. And with 30% in fuel savings, you'll save on every load. That's money in your pocket. Visit aggrowth.com/Nico for more info. That's aggrowth.com/Nico.